Welcome to our Hmong history series. Today we will share with you the story of a true friend of the Hmong. Edgar Pop Buell was specifically just Pop or Tan Pop, was a true friend to the Hmong and people of Laos, who dirtied his hands and did his work from his heart. So here we go. In 1958, Pop Buell joined the International Voluntary Services, or IVS, an organization formed among church and peace groups after the 1948 Marshall Plan, where the U.S. provided assistance to Europe for recovery after World War II. Pop was a widower. He suffered depression as a result of his wife's passing, and he was a successful Indiana farmer from Steuben County, Indiana. In 1960, he flew to Laos to work his new job in assisting small villages in humanitarian efforts involving farming and husbandry. Pop was assigned to a Hmong village on the Plain of Jars called Lat Huang, which was settled by new Hmong migrants from the surrounding mountains. Pop was in for a culture shock as an Indiana farmer. Upon arrival at Lat Huang, Edgar Buell was greeted by a young man who, through missionary teaching, knew just about the most English any native of Laos could learn. This young man's name was Muatzong. Muatzong was on the staff of the local IVS station. Muatzong was greeted by a rough and gruff-looking middle-aged Pop. Pop was 47 years old by the time he arrived in Laos. Muatzong and the other Hmong at Laos struggled to say Edgar, so Muatzong gave Mr. Buell the name Pop. After farming work and husbandry lessons, Muatzong took Pop to see his girlfriend, called My Si. Mua took Pop to her village for a local Hmong welcoming trial by fire. Muatzong introduced his future fiancée to Pop, who he was personally teaching English to, and invited Pop to dine with the local Hmong chieftains and Mua's new father-in-law. Pop tried Lao Lao, or race whiskey. To the surprise of all the Hmong, Pop downed the drink quickly and without much fuss, unlike all the other foreigners the Hmong have met. To the Hmong, Pop was different. Back in La Hua, Muatzong and Pop continued the IVS work, teaching new lowland farming techniques to the highland Hmong, bringing in a modern tractor and providing demonstrations to the locals. The two worked hand in hand, and Pop was soon developing a positive reputation among all the Hmong and Laos. After work, Muatzong would take Pop to try out the local Sicilian-run restaurant called the Million Elephant Restaurant, where the two would chit-chat about life in America and Muatzong's marriage plans and further studies in America. On one of these occasions at the Million Elephant Restaurant, while Pop was enjoying some sticky rice and papaya, he noticed Muatzong talking intently with an outstanding Hmong dressed in military attire with his Hmong soldiers. Muatzong introduced Pop to the leader, who went by the name of Vang Pop. He was a major, the highest-ranking Hmong military officer in all of Laos. Vang Pop warmly greeted Pop and offered his friendship. Not much was said in their first encounter, but Pop could tell Vang Pao was a man in a hurry. While Pop continued his work at the IVS station at La Huang, he came upon a letter addressed to him. It was from My Si, and she wrote distressingly about Muatzong not visiting her anymore after their encounter at her village. She was deeply worried and inquired if Pop would be able to reach Mua. To Pop's concern, he was wondering about Muatzong's frequent disappearances after work at IVS was finished. Pop brought up My Si's letter with Muatzong and asked him about where he was disappearing to. Muatzong simply replied that he was hunting at different Hmong villages and offered to bring Pop along for one of these hunting trips. Pop went along, and to his unpleasant surprise, they were hunting tigers. The local Hmong hunters gave Pop a rifle and offered him the chance to shoot the tiger that was being chased from the mountain jungle. Pop a farmer and quite a good marksman himself, took up the offer from his new Hmong friends and shot the tiger as it flew out from the jungle bushes. To the Hmong, Pop was unique and someone they could trust. Pop's reputation continued to grow through the Hmong hills and mountains. Once the two returned to their work at IVS at Laos, as Pop proved his mettle and was a sincere man, Mo Zong decided to come clean to Pop. He informed Pop that he was not going hunting through the past few months. He still loves my sea, and does indeed plan to marry her and bring her to study with him in America. However, he was gone so much because he was part of important work that was occurring throughout the Plain of Jars. Pop was intrigued. Mo Zong informed Pop that the Hmong military men that they met at the Million Elephant restaurant was planning something for the Hmong. The Vietnamese and communists were attacking the Hmong in neighboring Siem Reap province, and it is only a matter of time until the communists came onto the Plain of Jars. Major Vang Pao was preparing the Hmong for the future fight. Mo Zong told Pop on oath of secrecy that once the communist moves onto the Plain of Jars, the Hmong would move to predetermined bases around the Plain of Jars and continue the fight against the communists. Vang Pao had planned this since they can no longer rely on the French for help, and the US seems to only limit their interactions to the big Laos cities. The Hmong would have to defend themselves however they could. From these mountain bases, the Hmong would gather what supplies they could and launch their attacks on the communist lines of communication all over the Plain of Jars. Mo Zong had taken long absences from the IVS station because he had been working for Vang Pao, going from village to village, rallying the surrounding Hmong chieftains to Vang Pao's effort. Pop thought long and hard about what Mo Zong had to say, and he just simply told the young man to be careful, and for him to write to his lovesick fiancée and tell her to be safe too. Mo Zong nodded in agreement and went to write his letter. Meanwhile, in the Lao administrative capital, there was a military coup, led by a Lao military captain by the name of Kong Lei. He wanted to rid Laos of all foreign entanglement, calling upon all Americans and communists to leave Laos and free the country from corruption that was being bankrolled by the Americans. Kong Lei declared for neutralism and a neutralist government that would not follow the Americans in policy making. Back on the Plain of Jars, Major Vang Pao, upon hearing of Kong Lei's coup in Vientiane, turned to his military commanders gathered around him. He told them, "I will initiate a coup right here on the Plain of Jars." The military commanders around him was puzzled and dumbfounded, not knowing what Vang Pao was planning in his head. Vang Pao knew that there was a Kong Lei-aligned Lao military general that was flying into Sian Quang, and Vang Pao intended to intercept him at the Sian Quang airfield as soon as he landed. Upon the arrival of this Lao military general, Vang Pao's men were waiting on the runway, surrounding the airfield with men armed to the teeth. Once the Lao general got off the plane, Tulu Mua, a future colonel in Vang Pao's army, approached Kong Lei's general with pistol in hand, and the other Hmong soldiers fought off General Kong Lei's soldiers. Tulu and the Hmong soldiers brought Kong Lei's prized general to Vang Pao. Vang Pao immediately radioed down to Savannah Cat, where American-aligned rightist troops were headquartered. The rightist Lao general in Savannah Cat sent men to pick up Kong Lei's general, and Vang Pao's troops were provided with military weapons and supplies. By Christmas of 1960, the rightist forces from Savannah Cat, with American backing, marched up north onto Vientiane and Kong Lei's forces. Brutal street fighting ensued, and the American-backed rightists overwhelmed Kong Lei and his neutralist forces. Once Kong Lei lost Vientiane, he and his forces fled up north along Colonial Route 13, making the Americans and the rightists fear that Conglay and the Neutralists were going to attack the royal Lao capital of Luang Prabang, where the king of Laos resided. However, to the surprise of the Americans, Conglay did not head north to Luang Prabang, but he marched east towards the Plain of Jars. Using Colonial Road 7, which ran east and west through the Plain of Jars, Conglay and his forces overwhelmed the lightly stationed rightist troops that were on the plain. The Hmong and Pop were in the pathway of Conglay's forces. Unfortunately for the Hmong, but unsurprisingly, the communists from Vietnam and Sam Nay province also moved onto the Plain of Jars on the eastern edge of Colonial Route 7. Conglay was now firmly siding with the communists. Before, he was just receiving supplies from the Soviet Union, but now he was coordinating his troop movements with the communists. The Hmong were outnumbered. At La Huang, Conglay and the communists converged at Pong Savan and moved their troops from there towards La Huang, where Mo Zong and Tan Pa was working. The town of La Huang panicked as artillery fire exploded all around them, with Hmong fleeing with all their belongings. At IDS, the U.S. Embassy flew in an old cargo plane to pick up all the foreign aid workers stationed there. Mo Zong and Tan Pa were able to book a flight and flew just as Conglay's tanks rolled into the town square. Initially, Pop and Mo Zong thought they were going to be flown from La Huang towards Vientiane, as the plane was sent from the U.S. Embassy in Vientiane. However, they were not flown to Vientiane, but they were taken directly to Bangkok in neighboring Thailand. On the Plain of Jars, Conglay and the communists moved on Vang Pao's troops and took over the provincial capital of Siem Quang City. Vang Pao and his forces were dislodged. Vang Pao and his troops fled south with the provincial governor and the Royal Lao government staff, along with a chain of terrified refugees. Vang Pao moved towards the Lao town of Ta Vian and set up his lines of defense with his Hmong soldiers, while the Lao government and troops continued fleeing further south to Ta Ton. While Vang Pao and his Hmong soldiers made their stand at Ta Vian, they were suddenly approached by the American CIA. The CIA came in and recruited Vang Pao and his Hmong soldiers to join the Americans' effort to stem the tide of communist aggression inside of Laos. Vang Pao and the Hmong agreed with the Americans, and a new pact was formed tying the Americans and the Hmong. Conglay stopped after taking over Siem Quang City. The communists went on the offensive and made probing attacks on Vang Pao's troops around Ta Vian. As agreed with the Americans, Vang Pao moved his men from Ta Vian to a new location that was to be the base of operations for the new Hmong secret army, one where they could receive airdropped supplies. Vang Pao set up a new base at the village of Padang, which was one of the 7 momentum sites that were being created by the CIA to gather and train the Hmong to harass and attack the communists on the Plain of Jars. This was similar to Vang Pao's plan in creating predetermined bases to attack at the communist lines of communication. While the war was getting underway on the Plain of Jars, Pop was growing restless in Bangkok. He learned of the new Hmong war in Laos and heard streams of stories of Hmong refugees fleeing off the Plain of Jars. Pop worried deeply about his Hmong friends that were caught in the crosshair. Soon, Pop moved up back to Vientiane to continue work with IVS to help the 70,000 Hmong refugees that no one knew where they were located. The IDS was now working alongside U.S. aid, which was ramping up efforts to assist the Hmong. While Vang Pao and his forces settled at Padang, beginning their crash course 3 days training with the CIA and Thai advisors, the communists went after Hmong villages around the Plain of Jars, creating massive waves of refugees. The Hmong were fleeing south in droves, going anywhere they could, being lost in jungles and mountains where Vang Pao and the Americans could not keep track of them. Now that Operation Momentum was underway, the U.S. effort was ill-equipped to deal with it. Everyone wanted in on the action, the CIA, U.S. aid, and at this time the U.S. Army. Each were carving out their own fiefs of operations, jealous for some glory and promotion. There was bickering among the various government agencies, and arguments erupted. No one wanted to share any information, and each side wanted to lead the operation. The real loser in this office politics was the Hmong refugees, who were without food, and many were sick and homeless. From Vientiane, Pop watched the bureaucrats bicker and not actually offering any tangible help to the Hmong. He lobbied with the U.S. ambassador to locate and bring aid to the fleeing refugees, as he was one of the very, very few Americans who actually knew the Hmong. Pop was allowed to go up country to do his humanitarian work. To jumpstart the relief supplies, Pop went to the Hmong leader, Tu Milifong, who was the Lao Minister of Health and Social Welfare and the highest-ranking Hmong in government service. Tubi went to work with Pop to help the Hmong. Tubi tapped into the Lao government U.S. aid supplies and directed them away from the corrupt Lao politicians and sent them off to Vang Pao at Padang to distribute to the fleeing refugees. The two men pored over maps around the Plain of Jars. The American agencies actually did not even know where Padang was. That was a secret jealously kept by the CIA. However, Pop knew from his conversations with Motzong during their time together. Therefore, he had an approximation of where Padang was located. And after successfully lobbying the U.S. government, Pop was allowed to be sent to Padang via parachute route. The U.S. Army and Air America did not have any helicopters or small planes they were willing to use to drop off Pop. In an act of daring and maybe even stupid courage, Pop jumped out of an old C-47 Caribou plane and landed south of Padang. To Pop's surprise, he was greeted with Vang Pao's patrols that saw his parachute drop, and they addressed him as Tan Pop and said they knew him from the supplies he and Tui were dropping from the sky. Tan Pop was brought to Vang Pao at Padang, and there he saw the stream of refugees, CIA advisors, Thais, and soldiers. Vang Pao debriefed Tan Pop on the refugee situation and informed him of gathering sites and refugee movements. They talked of the coming U.S. aid supply drops and the need for more landing sites that the refugees needed to clear. Pop offered his assurances of IVS and U.S. aid supplies to Vang Pao. At Padang, as Pop was touring and talking to the refugees, he came upon Mai Si, who also arrived at Padang with her parents after the communists sent patrols to their village. She was distraught and worried about Motzong's whereabouts. Pop assured her of Motzong's continued affection and his determination to marry her as soon as possible. However, he informed her that upon their arrival in Bangkok, Motzong, being well tuned to Vang Pao's movement and one of the few Hmong good at English, was recruited by the U.S. Army to work as a radio operator deep in enemy territory, watching enemy convoys and reporting back. Mai Si listened intently and informed Pop that her father intended to head towards Vientiane City and for Motzong to find her there. Mai Si gave Pop a bundle of letters and asked him to deliver them to Motzong when he sees him. Pop agreed, and the two had a warm departure. After the day's work of greeting and distributing supplies, Pop and Vang Pao mapped out locations and areas that need the most help and where they lacked information. Vang Pao pointed out the town of Ban Na, where a large contingent of Hmong refugees were gathered there, and planes were unable to fly in because of the rain and mountain fog cover, as it was the rainy season. Pop, with a few of Vang Pao's guides, set off on foot from Padang and headed towards Ban Na. No planes were going to take them there. Pop's guides carried rifles, and he had with him a map, a radio, and a small knapsack with medicine. When Pop arrived in Ban Na, he saw a sight of desperation. There were at least 2,000 Hmong refugees gathered there in tents, starving and sick. They were not receiving any supplies, as the cloud coverage forbid planes from flying in. Pop met the local military commander at Ban Na, who was called Captain Tu Ye, who was walking among the Hmong encampments trying to offer words of encouragement. Sadly, in the background, Pop and Tu Ye could hear wails and shots of gunfire into the air, which signaled the death of a loved one among the Hmong. Here and there, breaking the silent nurturing, gunshots popped from within the encampment and among the hills, telling all that another Hmong had died. For 3 days and nights, the rain and clouds punished the Hmong, coming and falling endlessly among the desperate people. The 2,000 refugees would not last long if no food or medical supplies were airdropped. Attempted flights sent from Vang Pao could be heard overhead among the torrents of rain, but disappeared as the cloud and mountain cliffs were too dangerous to fly through. More gunshots were fired among the encampments and hills as more and more Hmong died. There was also an outbreak of dysentery that put everything at a critical point. Then, as if the Hmong prayers were answered, the rain stopped. Pop radio Padang and the supplies were dropped in for the Hmong. The crisis was now over. After medicine was administered and supplies distributed with Captain Tu Ye, Pop prepared himself and set off with a contingent of guides. They were heading north of the Plain of Jars to reach other Hmong refugees. On their treacherous path along the western edge of the Plain of Jars, a fellow Hmong guide stepped on an enemy mine and died. The other Hmong soldiers prayed for him and moved on. It was a sad reality for Tan Pop's Hmong friends. It was now war. As Pop made his way towards the village of Puvian, he came upon a Hmoob village nearby. The Hmoob chieftain waved for the Hmong to go away, but Pop approached the chief and offered his help. Tan Pop told the chief about Vang Pao, and the chief responded if the Hmong will help them too. Tan Pop replied that Vang Pao will help all people within Laos. The Hmoob village allowed Tan Pop and the Hmong soldiers to rest and were warmly sent off as they made their way to Buell Story. When Tan Pop arrived at Buell Story, he was greeted by Buell, also known as the Northern Warrior. Buell Story served as a northern base and was stubbornly defended by Buell. Once Pop got there, he radioed in supplies and distributed them among the refugees that were gathered there. Pop's next location was to find the refugees at the village of Pulu at Pusan. Buell informed Pop that there were thousands of refugees gathered there under the leader Tuli Mo, and they needed help. After reaching Pulu and coordinating relief, no planes could land safely at Pulu, as it was too close to enemy guns at Ban Ban Valley. Tan Pop and his guides made their way back to Buell Story. Pulu Pusan was close to the communist stronghold at Ban Ban Valley, where Colonial Road 6 from Samna met Colonial Road 7 coming from Nong Head and Vietnam. Shortly after Tan Pop had set off to Buell Story, the communists attacked Pulu Pusan. as Tulu was overwhelmed with refugees. After a fierce night fight with the communists, Tulu's forces and the refugees snuck out of Busan and made their way to Bomlong. As Tanpap, Mozupo, and Tulu gathered the fleeing refugees at Bomlong, they prepared for an impending attack. As there was news of communist movements towards their base, within days, the communists were spotted at the outskirts of Bomlong, with the enemy firing probing attacks on the Hmong defenders. The refugees began to panic, and droves of refugees ready to flee Bomlong towards Puvian. As the refugees were making their way to climb down Bomlong, Mozupo stopped them. "Only women and children can go," he said. "The men and boys over 14 must stay and fight. We will not lose this base." The men stopped and returned to the base camp after saying goodbye to their wives. The communist assault began the next day, shelling and charging up Bomlong. Mozupo led a fierce resistance, and the communists were beaten back. As the communist assault failed, the enemy retreated back down the hill. As supplies were not enough to feed the remaining refugees, Tanpap and Tulu went after to join the refugees fleeing to Puvian. Mozupo and his men remained behind to hold his base. And with that, we end our first part of the Tanpap story within our Hmong history series. Join us next time as we look at Tanpap's next obstacle and find out where Mozong is and whether Maisi's letter made their way towards him or not. Thank you and goodbye.